Well, welcome back to our class after a little break with our blizzard. And tonight we are just going to do a whirlwind, and we're going to do 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus, and Philemon too. So
not very much though, really.
It's not very long. So they're all shorter books. But so we're just going to jump through. Helen's joining us as well. And
Oh, good.
Give Helen a moment to join, but I'd love to hear. So before we started the recording, there were many, welcome Helen. There were quite a few opinions about the letters that we read tonight. And so what were your thoughts on 1 and 2 Timothy, Titus, and Philemon?
I thought Timothy was kind of demeaning towards people.
Yeah, the letters to Timothy.
Yeah, especially 1 Timothy at the beginning.
Right. So we have here 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus are known as the Pastoral Letters. And these ones are claimed to be Paul's final letters that would have been written after the book of Acts ends. So the book of Acts ends with Paul under house arrest in Rome. And then Paul is believed to be released from house arrest, and he's able to travel maybe for another 5 to 6 years, and then he's rearrested again by Roman authorities and then executed. And so the claim in these letters would be that these letters are being written by Paul to close co-workers of Paul, Timothy and Titus, which is why they're called the Pastoral Letters, because the other letters we've been reading were written to communities. Whereas this time, Paul's hearing about what's going on in communities, and rather writing to the community, is writing to the leaders of a community, and which would be Timothy and Titus. So that's the claim within the letters. There is a lot of debate whether or not these letters were actually written by Paul, because there's some things in these letters and the style doesn't match Paul's. Some of the claims doesn't match the other pieces of Paul's writing.
It doesn't sound the same.
The timeline is different. Some claim Paul's already dead by the time, based on the wording that's used in Greek in these letters, that these would have been later letters written in the name of Paul and weren't actually being written by Paul. Yeah, so Toby, you think this was probably not Paul? What do other
No,
people?
I don't. But I hadn't until you said that. It's harsher than Paul is, and it's more. What do you call it? This is the only way. What do you say? What does that mean? There's
Dictatorial.
Yeah, dictatorial. Yeah, I felt that through it. It irritated me. Well, part of it was I don't think he had much use for women. So
Yeah, according to these letters, somebody else should be leading this class. And
yeah, I mean, it wasn't, but there was something that I thought was absolutely awesome in it, and that was Timothy 2. When it says, if we have died with him, we will live with him. If we endure, we'll also reign with. I thought that was absolutely wonderful. So there were things like avoid, there are things like women, you have to avoid them.
John pointed out another view. Maybe it sounds different because Paul is writing to the leaders and not to the church itself.
Well, that makes sense. Why is this in here? Or is this just for the time? It says, yet the Lord rescued me from all of them. Indeed, all who want to live a godly life in Christ will be persecuted.
So they were
Was
still
that just for the time?
Yeah, so they were receiving persecution. And so the author is encouraging people that if you receive persecution, Like that's a part of this, is what is being argued, that you will receive persecution, because
Okay,
a lot
but
of
it
people
isn't-
are receiving that.
Yeah, but it wasn't like forever and ever.
Maybe he was grouchy because he was imprisoned.
That's
Yeah.
probably true. The other thing was nice that when there are things that are very nice about it too. You know, it says, at my first defense, no one came to my support, thought everybody deserted me, but the Lord stood by me and gave me strength. I found that there was like a lot of juxtaposition with things that I found were not friendly, and then things that were really, really good.
Yep.
It was almost like two people writing it.
Some of the structure, the keys here within this. So Paul is writing to, or whoever the author is writing to Timothy in Ephesus. And we see that in chapter 1, verse 3, kind of that key of where is it being written to. And we'll remember that Paul established a base in Ephesus. And so we've got, it's being written to an established church in that place. And then we get into more of the structure of the church. And I always found this under chapter 3, verse 15. Another word for the church as a household of God. We get that imagery within this letter. And we get the structure of how to more detailed structure a church with different types of leaders within the church. What would be the role of these different types of leaders? And then we move more out of the structure into the life of the church itself, starting in 5. How do you live as this community with one another? And then that takes us through to the closing of this letter and an encouragement to Timothy towards the end.
Yeah, I was wondering in chapter 5 if that whole thing about widows and is partially that he doesn't want the church to have to pay for them. He's trying to save money for the churches and telling, hey, families, take care of your own. Don't rely on the social services of the church.
Yeah, which is really against what Paul's saying in a lot of other places. And
I just don't, it just seems different than the way Paul wrote.
yeah. And then so we'd have First Timothy. We'll go deeper into these two with some of the Bible Project and other things. The next letter, as far as what they believe would be written next, would be Titus.
Sorry
And
if I'm.
and this one is really similar to Timothy in kind of some of the styles in Titus, also one of the pastoral letters. And so we have here in Titus this other, just a short letter that's being written. And then the next one after Titus would be 2 Timothy, would be the next one.
I have a question. What does this mean? I mean, I get it, but I don't get part of it. You know, when of course, I absolutely hate it, but about women to be self-controlled, chaste, good managers, all that, submissive to their husbands. But then it says being submissive to their husbands so that the word of God may not be discredited.
Well, they're
so that if women are doing something bad, then they would be discredited in the eyes of, if they were Christians, then people would think they were bad and wouldn't follow the Christianity because of their behavior.
Or another possibility would be that there's some female leaders that they're not agreeing with.
Oh,
And,
okay, yeah.
and they're
Okay.
saying, don't listen to them, otherwise, because they're not
Okay.
speaking what we
Okay.
agree with. Because there are women leaders in the church, in the early church. We see that in the other letters, and they wouldn't be speaking against that if it wasn't happening.
Well, good.
So there's definitely very strong female leaders in the church, and females who are underwriting a lot of what's happening in the church with their own funding.
Yeah, but couldn't it also have been because in that era, weren't the male of the house responsible towards in society for the household? And if someone discredited or did something wrong in the household, it was blamed back on to the, I don't know, the leader of the household, owner of the household, whatever you want to call the male person.
Right.
Yes, he
Yep.
couldn't contain his wife.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. In this one, John pointed out, Paul seems to be concerned with the image of all believers. It's certainly how do we convey ourselves.
And you got to remember the time too.
Yep. It was a harsh time. Yeah. And it did matter. Your social status mattered in this time. And these are later letters. And so thinking about that early on, we have in Acts, we have this community being told, like, take all your possessions and share them with each other, and just live as one community with one another, and it's all going to be great and perfectly fine. Which obviously, like, they did that, and it wasn't great and perfectly fine because people didn't agree with what was being done, or some people had more and then greed crept in, or things that broke apart crept in. And so they're trying to figure out, okay, we do live in this world, we live in this society where there is still a hierarchy, not just male female hierarchy, but there's a hierarchy in people who are citizens, people who are slaves, different levels of slavery, different levels of being free. And so how do we exist in that when we still need to live our lives? Because it's becoming a longer time period since they're hearing, well, Christ will return, and time keeps ticking on. And so how do we do this in the midst of that? And so I think whoever wrote these letters were able to hear in them how the church is struggling to figure out, okay, how do we live within society and follow the ways of Christ? How do we do both of these things?
One thing that I think that I'm getting from this that I never thought of before is it's kind of amazing that this has all lasted. That this it just think all the things that have happened, the wars, the people, all the different things that have gone on. It's just amazing.
Yeah. Well, last week's scripture reading, in Acts, we heard about how the apostles went before the Sanhedrin, the council in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And the Sanhedrin told them, you have to stop talking about Jesus or we're going to kill you.
Yeah.
And they said, well, we have to, like, this is of God. And so they were put out, and one of the Sanhedrin, one of the council members said, let's just leave them alone, because if this is of human nature, it's just going to burn out, because most movements do just burn out. And for some reason, this didn't. And even that council, Sanhedrin, is pointing to, this must be of God, that this would not just burn out.
I never thought of it that way, but I think that's true. It's amazing that this,
there was a lot working against it. We hear about all of the persecution that's happening.
Right.
And it is true that sometimes when leaders are killed and then they become martyrs and then the movement can get bigger. but it doesn't usually get bigger for thousands of years.
Yeah.
It might get bigger temporarily and then people move away from it. And Paul is doing a lot throughout this, and so are the other apostles and disciples. They're doing a lot to start the church off. Paul goes on 3 journeys. He visits the churches, sets them up. He revisits them on his way back. He goes and does more visits. And there's others who are joining him, and they're going around to different places too. But we also
Gretchen-
hear stories of some of the other apostles or disciples who are joining, helping to start churches, and like they get burned out and they can't do it anymore. And they say, I'm done. And then there's others who are like, I'm in all the way. I'm going to help, and I'm going to be doing this western part, and I'm going to do this eastern part. I'm taking this area, and they're helping to continue the leadership. But keeping that communication the same and consistent throughout is also difficult.
But it's amazing that this went all through Europe. And this is far from Europe at the time, so except maybe because of the Romans. I don't know, but it's absolutely amazing.
Yeah. We have letters attributed to Paul, but there would have been other letters too, and others who were moving this movement along who weren't writing. Maybe they weren't literate, but they were part of this and moving it along and starting churches and a part of that.
Are there any books on how this moved into Europe? I'd love to read that. If there's something about how did Christianity get from the Middle East to the...
Yeah, any books looking at the history or development of the early church would be...
Do we have any in our library?
I can look to see if we have some.
Thanks.
Yeah. Well, would we like to watch? I know John's already watched the Bible study or Bible project videos on 1st and 2nd Timothy. But I don't know if others have. So I wonder if we want to...
Try your TV. Mine doesn't work. Oh, sorry.
Hi, Evan.
Apparently our TV isn't working.
Well, hello, Gretchen.
Good to hear you.
I saw you yesterday.
I know. It's been a lucky week.
Yes, my TV is working fine.
Sorry. Coming tomorrow at 8.
Sorry, Evan.
Well, let's watch the 1st Timothy video, and then we'll switch into Titus, and then we'll see where we are as far as time. Decide if we want to switch into 2nd Timothy or if we want to continue on to watch this video. So this is on Bible
Timothy.
Project First.
Paul spent many years traveling about and starting new churches, and he developed a large team of co-workers in this mission. Timothy was one of these. Paul was once in the city of Lystra, and he met Timothy's faithful mother and grandmother, and he was impressed by Timothy's passion and devotion to Jesus. And so Paul mentored him for many years and eventually started sending him on missions to different churches. And so when Paul got word about a group of leaders who infiltrated the influential church in Ephesus, they were spreading incorrect views about Jesus and what it means to follow him, he sent Timothy to confront these leaders and restore order to this church. So after Timothy arrived there, Paul sent this letter to follow up and instruct him on how to fulfill this mission. The letter has a really cool design. There's an opening and closing commission to Timothy to go confront these leaders and their bad theology. And then these surround 2 large central sections that are full of really practical instructions about the problems that Timothy faced in the Ephesian church. And then finally, all these sections are linked together or concluded by a series of 3 poems that each exalt the risen Jesus as the King of the world. Let's dive in and you'll see how it works. Paul opens by recalling how he sent Timothy to Ephesus to confront these leaders who were spreading their strange teaching. And he describes how these guys are obsessed with speculating about the Torah, specifically the early stories and genealogies in the book of Genesis. And as we'll see, they had developed all kinds of weird teachings about food and marriage and sex that weren't consistent with the teachings of Jesus or the apostles. He even names some of these people, Alexander and Hymenaeus, and he describes how their teaching has divided the church, it's generated controversy. And Paul says this is actually the first clear sign that their teaching is distorted. When genuine Christian teaching is done, it's faithful to the way of Jesus, and it results in love and genuine faith. And he says the purpose of the Torah anyway isn't to fuel speculation. Rather, its purpose is to expose the truth about the human condition, as it did for Paul. Correct teaching about the Torah will lead people to see the grace of God revealed in the Messiah, who came to save sinful, broken people. And so Paul closes here with a poem that honors King Jesus over all, and he calls Timothy to shut these men and their false teaching down. He then addresses very specific problems in this church caused by the false teachers. First of all, he calls Timothy to hold regular church prayer gatherings, to pray for the governing leaders of Rome and for peace, because peace in the land, it creates an ideal setting for Jesus' followers to keep spreading their message about the God of peace, who wants all people to
What
be
happened?
saved, the God who sent Jesus as the only mediator to give his life as a ransom for all. In contrast to the false teachers, Paul reminds Timothy that God wants to rescue the whole world, and prayer is going to keep this at the forefront of their minds. Paul then addresses problems related to men and women who are being influenced by these corrupt leaders in Ephesus. So he first shuts down a group of men who are getting drawn into angry theological disputes started by the teachers. He says these guys should learn how to pray. Then he confronts a group of wealthy women in the church who were treating the Sunday gathering like a fashion show. They were dressing so upscale that they would shame most of the other people who couldn't afford such a wardrobe. And not only that, but some of these women were also usurping leadership positions in the church, and they were teaching others the bad theology of the corrupt teachers. And so Paul shuts these women down. He says they should not teach or lead in the church. And then he goes on to explore the story of Adam and Eve and the serpent from Genesis chapter 3. Now, this is one of those sections in Paul's letters where, like Peter said, he's kind of hard to understand. There are many different views about what Paul meant here. Some think that Paul is prohibiting women from ever teaching or leading men in any church, and that his comments about Adam and Eve are about how God has ordered that only men should be leaders in the church. There are others who think that Paul is prohibiting women from having leadership authority over men in a church, but that once educated women should and can teach as leaders in a church under male leadership. And there are still others who think that Paul is only prohibiting these women in Ephesus, and that his comments about Adam and Eve are a comparison of how these women have been deceived by the false teachers. Whichever view you take, Paul is clear that these Ephesian women need to come under Timothy's leadership and get a proper theological education. And the goal is to help them grow so that they could one day become like the outstanding female ministers that Paul mentions in his other letters, like Phoebe or Junia or Priscilla. Paul continues to address this leadership crisis, and he calls Timothy to appoint a small, healthy team of husbands and fathers who will act like elders or overseers for the church. These should be men of outstanding character and integrity, and they will work alongside a team of deacons. It's a Greek word that means servant. And these are men and women who actually lead and do the ministries of the church, and they are to have the same kind of character as the elders. And all together, these people should be known for healthy relationships in their families, because that will demonstrate their ability to lead in the church, which is God's family. And the way of life that they live all together, it's consistent with the story about Jesus, which is explored in the closing poem, about his incarnation, his death, his resurrection, his exaltation as king, and then the spread of his new family throughout the whole world. Paul's second body of instructions for Timothy are, again, very specific to the problems caused by these bad leaders. So he first corrects their bad theology. They've been telling people to stop eating certain kinds of foods, most likely meat, and to stop getting married, which Paul thinks is ridiculous. So he goes to Genesis 1, and he reminds Timothy that God's entire creation is very good, including food and marriage. It is all to be received with gratefulness by those who know and give thanks to the Creator. Paul then moves on to address problems about the church's care of widows. So this very important ministry was being taken advantage of by younger, wealthy widows, most likely the same troublemaking women from chapter 2. They would sign up for the church's support, but then spend their days sleeping around, spreading gossip, and damaging the church's reputation in the city. Paul is having none of it. He says that only older widows that have no other family support qualify, and for these, the church should show the love and generosity of Jesus. Paul then addresses problems among some older men in the church, and Timothy is to respect their age but not their misbehavior, which seems to be alcohol related. They're damaging the church's reputation in Ephesus. And so Timothy is in love to confront them and have them step down if they're in leadership. And then Paul adds this interesting side note that this doesn't mean that Timothy himself should never drink. Given his stomach problems, he should probably have a glass of wine each night with dinner. Paul then addresses a problem among Christian slaves. Some of them were disrespecting their Christian masters. And so, yes, the gospel creates equality among Jesus' followers. However, Paul thinks that equality needs to be implemented in a strategic way that doesn't compromise the mission and witness of the church. If Christians become associated with slave rebellions, they are compromised. The Christian transformation of the Roman household had to be implemented strategically so that their neighbors could be persuaded and not repulsed by this new vision of God's family. Finally, Paul closes the letter by calling Timothy again to confront the corrupt leaders. Paul here exposes their motives to make lots of money by accumulating followers and then charging them all high rates for their teaching. These teachers betray Jesus and his message of contentment and simple living. And so Paul instructs the wealthy Ephesian Christians to become rich in good works and generosity, to be people who submit all of their resources to King Jesus, and he's the one who inspires the final poem about how he is the true king above all other kings. 1 Timothy is a really important letter. It helps us gain a holistic vision of the nature and mission of the church. So what a Jesus community believes will directly shape how that community lives and behaves in its city. And so its theology, its beliefs have to be constantly critiqued and formed by the scriptures and the good news about Jesus. And how the church is perceived in public is also very important to Paul. Christians should be known as people who are full of integrity, known for good works, known for serving the poor and the most vulnerable, all out of devotion to the risen King Jesus. And that's what 1 Timothy is all about.
So there you have it. So there's some more insight, another view of some of those problematic pieces in 1 Timothy. Any thoughts with that video?
If anybody ever reads this Bible later, they're gonna wonder, because I had written in it, I'd like to see a man have a child. With reference when it says she will be saved through childbearing, provided that they continue in faith, love, and holiness.
You should direct people to your written in Bible whenever you do your will, or
Yeah, because I have stuff all over. I have things like the one on the, about his wife has to be a certain way and keeping his children as a wife and everything. I have written down there stupid.
Well, let's jump into Titus next. So we saw that letter. So we're jumping around a little bit, but kind of looking at them in order of potentially when they were written. And so this is Titus, and let's just dive into the Bible Project video for Titus.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Cretans are people from Crete, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Paul's letter to Titus. Titus was a Greek follower of Jesus who was for years a trusted co-worker and traveling companion of Paul's. He had helped Paul in a number of crisis situations in the past, and in this letter we discover that Paul had assigned him the task of going to Crete, a large island off the coast of Greece, to restore order to a network of house churches. Now, Cretan culture was notorious in the ancient world. One of the Greek words for being a liar was kretidzo, to be a Cretan. These people were infamous for treachery and greed. Most of the men on the island had served as mercenary soldiers to the highest bidder, and the island cities were known as being unsafe, plagued by violence and sexual corruption. However, the island of Crete had many strategic harbors, and they serviced cities all over the ancient Mediterranean Sea. And so, from Paul's point of view, Crete was the perfect place to start a network of churches. Now, we don't know the details, but somehow these churches came under the influence of corrupt Cretan leaders. They said they were Christians, but they were ruining the churches. And so Paul assigned Titus with the task of going there to set things straight, and this letter provided the instructions. It has a pretty straightforward design. After a brief introduction, Paul gives Titus clear instructions about his tasks in the church. He then offers guidance about the new kind of household, and then about the new kind of humanity that the gospel could create in these Cretan communities. Paul then closes the letter with some final greetings. So Paul opens the whole thing by reminding Titus that his message as an apostle is about the hope of eternal life, that is, the life of the new creation, that is available starting now through Jesus the Messiah. And this hope was promised long ago by the God who does not lie. Now, this little opening comment introduces an important theme underlying the whole letter. One of the problems in the Cretan churches was that they had assimilated their ideas about Jesus, the Christian God, to their ideas about the Greek gods that they grew up with, specifically Zeus, their chief god. Cretan people claimed that Zeus was actually born on their island, and they loved to tell stories and mythologies about Zeus's underhanded character. He would seduce women and lie to get his way. And Paul wants to be really clear. The God revealed through Jesus is totally different than Zeus. His basic character traits are faithfulness and truth, which means the Christian way of life will be about truth also, which will be a real change for these Cretans. So Paul then addresses Titus with a twofold task. He says the first one is to appoint new leaders for each church community, a team of what he calls elders, mature husbands or fathers, whose way of life is totally different from Cretan culture. They're to be known for integrity, total devotion to Jesus, for self-control and generosity, both in their families and in the community at large. And these new leaders are to teach the good news about Jesus and replace the corrupt leaders who need to be confronted. That's Titus's second task. Paul identifies the teachers as those of the circumcision. In other words, they were ethnically Jewish Cretans who said that they followed Jesus, but similar to the problems in Galatia, these people demanded that non-Jewish Christians be circumcised and follow the laws of the Torah if they really wanted to become followers of the Jewish Messiah. Paul says that they're obsessed with Jewish myths and human commands, and to top it off, they're just in the church leadership business to make money. And so Paul, in a brilliant move, he pulls a quote from an ancient Cretan poet, Epimenides, who was very frank and honest about the character of his own people. He said Cretans are always liars, vicious beasts, and lazy gluttons. They blur the lines between true and false, between good and evil, and they're just in it for the money. And so while these leaders claim to know God, their Cretan way of life denies him. They have to be dealt with. And this leads Paul into the next section. Because of these corrupt leaders, many Christians in these churches now have homes and personal lives that are a total wreck. And 3 different times, Paul highlights the result of all this. The message about Jesus is discredited. Their non-Christian neighbors now have good cause to make evil accusations. And all of this makes the teaching about God, our Savior, totally unattractive and not compelling to anybody. So Paul paints a picture of the ideal Cretan household that is devoted to Jesus. It would be elderly men and women who are full of integrity and self-control, so they can become models of character to the young people. And the young women shouldn't be sleeping around and avoiding marriage, as was fashionable on Crete at the time, but rather they should be looking for faithful partners so they can raise stable, healthy families. And the young men are to do the same. They're to be known as productive, healthy citizens. Christian slaves on Crete were in a unique position because we know that because of the gospel, they were treated as equals in Paul's church communities. However, there was a danger that they would use that equality as license to disrespect their masters and then become associated with slave rebellions, which would further discredit the Christian message. You can see Paul negotiating a fine line here. He believes that the gospel about Jesus needs to prove its redemptive power in the public square if it's really going to transform Cretan culture. And that's not going to happen through social upheaval or by Christians cloistering away from urban life. The Christian message will be compelling to Cretans when Christians fully participate in public life, when their lives and homes look similar on the surface. Because after a closer look, their neighbors will discover that Christians live by a totally different value system out of devotion to a totally different God. And that's the difference that Paul beautifully summarizes at the end of chapter 2. He says the value system driving the Christian way of life is God's generous grace, which appeared in the person of Jesus and will appear again at his return. This grace was demonstrated when Jesus gave up his honor to die a shameful death on behalf of his enemies, so that he could rescue and redeem them. And it's that same grace that calls God's people to say no to corrupt ways of life that are inconsistent with the generous love of God. Paul then zooms out from the Christian household to a vision of Christians living like new humans in Cretan society. Of all people, Christians should be known as the ideal citizens, peaceable, generous, obedient to authorities, known for pursuing the common good. But this is really different from how Cretans grew up. How are Christians supposed to sustain this countercultural way of life? And Paul believes the power source is the transforming love of the three-in-one God announced in the gospel. And he explores this with a really beautiful poem. He says, God's kindness and love are what saved us, despite ourselves, so that through the Holy Spirit, God washed and rebirthed and renewed people, and through Jesus has provided a way for people to be declared right before him. And all of this opens up eternal life, that is, a new future in the new creation. This living story is so powerful, it can produce new kinds of people. Paul's convinced that Spirit-empowered faithfulness to the teachings of Jesus will declare God's grace all over the island of Crete and all over the world. Paul concludes by promising to send backup for Titus, either Artemis or Tychicus, and then he says hello to their common friends. And so the letter ends. The letter of Titus shows us Paul's missionary strategy for churches to become agents of transformation within their communities. It won't happen by waging a culture war or by assimilating to the Cretan way of life. Rather, he calls these Christians to wisely participate in Cretan culture. They need to reject what's corrupt, but also embrace what's good there. If they can learn to live peaceably and devote themselves to Jesus and to the common good, Christians will, in his words, show the beauty of the message about our saving God. And that's what the letter to Titus is all about.
Sorry.
Right. Any thoughts on Titus?
I don't think I read Titus. I read 1st and 2nd Timothy. So tiny, I can probably skim it right now.
One of the things that's in all of these pastoral letters, Ed, is that the way of following Christ is something that will show itself through a changed way of living. And that's an important theme throughout these letters. Once we get underneath the cultural differences, we're speaking about a different culture, a different time. So there's things that really rub really the wrong way as we read some of these things. But getting beneath there, it is saying, how is our lives totally changed? And that's the way to evaluate if your church ministry is actually being effective, is that the way people are living is changing. And if the way people are living is changing, then the ministry of the church is being effective. And yeah, John, you're right. It is the same issues as Timothy. 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus address a number of the same issues. And I would say as far as churches today too, churches today struggle with figuring out, how am I transformational? How do I take part in the wider culture? Do I just war against it? Do I work with it? How do we do that? And Christianity on a large scale has really struggled with that as well,
Mhm.
of how to do that well.
Okay.
So what, any preference on next, if we want to jump into, so Camille, we went through 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, and then we're also doing Philemon tonight too.
Oh, we are.
We are.
Okay.
So we're getting caught up after our blizzard here. So,
Okay.
Gretchen,
yeah.
the one thing that I think out of this whole, reading the whole Bible, that made me feel so good was the 3rd chapter of Titus. Because in a nutshell, it explains Christianity. You know, from 4, or actually 3, all the way down. You know, saved us not because of works, not because what we did.
Yeah. The grace aspect comes through in all of these letters. And it is so important that whenever any of these letters, the gospel tries to shine forth through it. And it's not just about, they are addressing issues. They are talking about, how do you restructure church? How do you do the practical stuff? But what's the most important is always, whatever you're doing, also include the gospel in that message of grace throughout all of it. And that's so strong throughout these letters.
I never realized this, you know, we just didn't dwell on these. These books were not the major, but I just loved it.
Yeah. And really, when you read them one after the other, that comes out even more strongly than if you're just reading parts of it or you're reading one of the books.
I really don't know why 1st, 2nd Timothy, and even Titus was included in the canon. And
Was
then
what?
when I really read them, I thought, well, of course they were included in the canon, because they went away from what Paul had stressed previously in community, in striving on an individual basis to be Christ-like in all of their living. And from 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, we get into the hierarchical model. The deacons have to be just right. The women can't be seen, should be seen and not heard. And they refer to the faith as the one coalescing feature in life. And they find a lot of problems with people that don't fit their idea of the ideal. And I think we have carried that into the present to our detriment. I think churches that are trying to get back to the community feel are going to do better than those who are still maintaining and forcing structure, a hierarchical structure on folks.
Yeah.
And I don't think Paul wrote these. I just don't.
You're not alone in that.
Yeah, it's just too far afield from everything else he has written that we have studied so far.
What's a lot more touchy-feely?
What do you mean touchy-feely?
Personal.
Yeah, they have more of a personal feel, especially 2nd Timothy starts a little more personal. Calling Timothy my beloved child, even.
Mhm.
Because most of when Paul is writing, he seems more like a theologian. You know, it's very It's like learning something out of a book of scholarship or scholarly and
Mhm.
not as personal. I mean, that's how I felt.
I also want women to dress modestly and decently, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or expensive clothes. Their adornment should be the good works that are proper for women who profess to be religious. Women are to be quiet and completely submissive during religious instruction. I don't permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She must remain silent. After all, Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not the one deceived. It was, do I need to go any further? I mean,
I just threw that out. I
I
threw it out.
well,
I
you
have a
know,
big question mark that says why, but then I thought, look, it's the time. You know,
Of
like I
course.
said below,
Yep.
I'd like to
Another
see a man have a child.
presented opinion on that, Camille, too, is that they were having trouble with particular women in Ephesus.
okay,
In that
okay.
this one interpretation is that this is being written not to all women, but to these particular women who are
Mhm.
taking over leadership, who are dressing to make everybody else look
Appropriately.
bad and
Uh-huh.
doing some things. And they're saying, you who are doing these things against the community should stop.
Mhm.
And you're not
Mhm.
allowed to lead anymore.
Mhm. Mhm.
Because which,
Right.
remembering
know
too,
that
this is being written to the leadership and not to the
Mhm.
community.
Mhm.
But the
Mhm.
interesting thing is when they talk about Adam and Eve, you know, in this, and how Eve was that Adam was not deceived, but the woman was the deceiver. Well, the opposite of that is, my God, Adam was dumb.
Yeah, I mean, Adam just took, where
Mhm.
did he think it came from?
Mhm. Mhm.
I mean, he
You
had
know,
seen the fruit on the tree before. Where did he think it came from?
Yeah, but just look at the difference in the timber. When Paul was writing, he really elevated Lydia. He entreated Euodia and Syntyche to get together. He was interested in making the church, the whole church, be loving and receive the grace. I think he was concentrating more on individual understanding of grace and love and mercy and compassion working together within the community. This sets out, this is what you have to be and do to be a leader in the church. And I really have problems with it because even though this was written 2,000 years ago, people are still taking it out of context here and there and everywhere.
Yeah.
And using it to prove their point, to put other people down.
Hmm.
I have a real problem with that. I have a real problem with that.
Yeah.
It's the same with the letter to Ephesus. And I think the problem was the same. There were women who were standing up wanting to convert others or proselytize to pagan religions. And yeah, it was right to tell them to sit down and shut up. But this I think was a slap in the face. I did not like it. I did not like it. Okay, so I spent under there. Okay. Okay, so what are we reading for next time?
Let's watch one more video. This is the last book of the night. And
Okay.
just so that
Okay.
we're able to finish the New Testament in this month.
Great.
So we're in May, not, we're still in April, I guess.
We're getting there.
Yep. Yep.
All right. So one
It
more,
started before the pandemic.
it did. Yep.
Paul's letter to Philemon. It was written during one of Paul's many imprisonments, and it's actually his shortest letter in the New Testament, but don't let its size trick you. It's actually one of the most explosive things that Paul ever wrote. Here's the backstory that we can piece together from details within the letter. Philemon was a well-to-do Roman citizen from Colossae who likely met Paul during his mission in Ephesus, and he became a follower of Jesus. Then later, when Paul's co-worker Epaphras started a Jesus community in Colossae, Philemon became a leader of a church that met in his house. Now, Philemon, like all household patriarchs in the Roman world, owned slaves, one of whom was named Onesimus. And at some point, these two had a serious conflict. Onesimus wronged Philemon in some way. Maybe it was theft, or maybe he cheated him. We don't exactly know. But afterwards, Onesimus ran away. Eventually, Onesimus came to Paul in prison, likely to appeal for help. And in the process, he became a follower of Jesus and then a beloved assistant of Paul. And so Paul finds himself in a very difficult and delicate situation as he writes this letter. He's going to ask Philemon not just to forgive Onesimus and receive him back, but to embrace him as a brother in the Messiah and no longer as a slave. Here's how he does it. Paul opens with a prayer, first praising Philemon and thanking God for the love and faithfulness he's shown to Jesus, to his people. And he then paves the way for his request with this line: I pray that the partnership that springs from your faith may effectively lead you to recognize all the good things at work in us, leading us into the Messiah. Now, a key word here is partnership, or in Greek, koinonia. It means sharing or mutual participation. It's when two or more people receive something together and share in it, becoming partners. Paul's saying that faithfulness to Jesus means recognizing that all of his followers are equal partners who share together in the gift of God's love and grace. And for Paul, this experience of koinonia among Jesus' followers, it's not just an idea that you think about, it's something that you do in your relationships. Which moves Paul on to his request. He finally brings up Onesimus. He says that he's become Paul's child in prison, meaning that Paul led Onesimus to dedicate his life and allegiance to Jesus, and so Paul and Onesimus are now family members in the Messiah. He's been serving Paul faithfully in prison, and even though Paul wants to keep him around, he knows that this unresolved conflict with Philemon has to be reconciled if they say that they're followers of Jesus. Which moves Paul on to his bold request, that Philemon receive Onesimus back, no longer as a slave, but as more than a slave, as a beloved brother in the Lord. Now, this is a really tall order. Under Roman law, Philemon had every legal right to have Onesimus punished or put in prison, and Paul's not only asking him to forgive Onesimus, but to welcome back his former slave into Colossae as a social equal, as a family member. This is way more than kindness. This is unheard of. It's freeing a slave and then treating them like a family member. It upsets the status quo of the Roman social order. Why should Philemon do such a thing? And here Paul pulls a brilliant move. He recalls that key word from the opening prayer. He says, if you're truly a partner with me, it's that Greek word koinonia again, then welcome Onesimus as if he were me. And if he's wronged you or owes you anything, charge it to me and I will repay it. So in this request, we see the heart of Paul's gospel message being acted out. It's first of all about reconciliation. It's just like he told the Corinthians. In the Messiah, God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting people's sins against them. So in this situation, Paul is putting himself in the place of Jesus. He will absorb the consequences of Onesimus' wrongdoing. He will pay the cost so that he can be reconciled to Philemon. But Paul's message was about more than just a legal transaction. It's also about koinonia. Onesimus and Philemon and Paul are all equals before God. They all share the same need for forgiveness. And so the ground is level before the cross, which means that Philemon and Onesimus can no longer relate to each other as master and slave. They're family members. They're brothers in the Messiah. Or as Paul told Philemon and the whole church of Colossae, in God's new family, people are not Greek or Jewish or circumcised or uncircumcised or foreigners or uncivilized or slave or free, but the Messiah is all and is in all people. Paul closes the letter stating his confidence that Philemon will do even more than Paul's requested. And he asks him to prepare a guest room because he wants to visit as soon as he gets out of prison. And then with some final greetings, Paul ends the letter. Paul's letter to Philemon is powerful for many reasons. It's the only letter where Paul doesn't explicitly mention Jesus' death or resurrection, and this is not an oversight. He doesn't need to explain the cross with words because he's demonstrating it through his actions. Paul's embodying here the meaning of the cross. He has made himself the place through which Onesimus and Philemon are reconciled to God and then to each other. This letter also shows us that the implications of the good news about Jesus, they are extremely personal and never private. The fact that Philemon and Onesimus are now brothers in the Messiah, it makes their master-slave relationship totally irrelevant. The family of Jesus' people is the place where all are equal recipients of God's grace. It's a new kind of society, or a new humanity, as he called it in the letter to the Colossians, where people's value and social status, it's not defined by race or gender or social or economic class. In the Messiah, there are simply new humans who are equal partners, who share together in God's healing mercy through Jesus. And that's what Paul's letter to Philemon is all about.
I just love this letter. If you look at chapter 1, verses, actually 17 through 19, I'm reading 19 right now. I, Paul, write this in my own hand. I agree to pay. And I won't even mention that you owe me your very self. But I won't mention it.
I won't mention it, but I will.
I think this is a beautiful letter, just a beautiful letter.
This was obviously a very powerful story in Paul's life. That it became part of this and became a story for Paul that told the gospel message.
Yep.
Because we see allusions to this story in other parts of the letter as well.
But I love the emphasis that to accept this slave that was very legal. He could have had Onesimus put to death if he really wanted to. He could have had him played. He could have had him in prison for the rest of his life, but he chose not to. He asked that this slave be accepted, not as a slave, but as a brother in Christ. I just think it's beautiful.
Any other thoughts tonight on these 4 books? I know we've gone through a lot. Next, we'll read for May 4th, we'll read Hebrews and James.
Okay.
So Hebrews is a little longer piece, but James isn't very long. And there's a reading schedule that's coming out in the newsletter too.
Oh, good.
So we'll do Hebrews and James next week. The week after that, we'll do 1st and 2nd Peter. And then the week after that, we'll do 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. And then in our final week of May, we'll do Jude and Revelation.
I am so glad we're doing this because my whole religion has been kind of Lutheran Church, and in all the others, it kind of stops after the 4 Gospels.
And so had it through the 4 Gospels. At least you had the 4 Gospels.
What did you say?
I said at least you had the 4 Gospels.
Well, and then Romans. That was was there too. But the rest of it in Acts. None of this stuff about how the church really started, I ever had. In all that confirmation that I had for years. And it's beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it is. Yes,
And
it
it's
is.
also like miraculous.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you.
Yes,
Thank
thank
you.
you very much.
So same, will be online, Hebrews and James, 6:30 next Wednesday. And we're just gonna keep the consistent schedule throughout May and finish this up.
Okay,
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Yeah,
thank you.
thank you.
Great.
Bye.
Thank you.